Hello friends, good evening. Myself Viraj and I welcome you all to the session of Mains Probable where we will be discussing topics that are important from the point of view of Mains 2025. Before that, we will take into consideration PYQs and we will also look into overall demand of UPSC when it comes to specific topics. Alright, so for the purpose of those students who are writing in 2025, now revision becomes easy. Taking into consideration what points have to be added in the answer, that becomes easy. So even if you have just fillers, say suppose with respect to some questions, those fillers what they will do is they will help you to at least build some answer. Okay. Other than that, abhi se what can happen is a mental framework will be built of yours as to what has to go in my answer. Okay. That is basically our endeavor. So without any further ado, what I will do is I'll start with the topics. This is our syllabus. More or less you know about it. Those students who are writing mains this year, they obviously know about it. Those who are writing next year, even they could have a quick look over it. Dekho, more or less now on each topic or on each pointer of the syllabus there is one question. IR in paper 2 consists of 50 marks. It consists of 50 marks. For last many years, the questions have been coming for 50 marks only. Okay. So 2 questions will be 30 markers and 2 questions will be 10 markers. And compulsorily, one question will be from each of the pointers. So all the pointers basically becomes easy. Now those who are writing exam this year, now what I will suggest is on these pointers, whatever is in current affairs, get a quick glance of it or revise it quickly. Why? Because IR ka paper is current affairs ka paper. IR ka questions are current affairs ka question. Question theoretical, that is book based, are very rare in IR. Those who are writing next year, to an extent they have to read a material. They can read notes of GS score. Through that what will basically happen is they will have some theoretical routing. Those who are writing this year, that theoretical routing at this point of time you cannot go to have. Focus upon your current affairs and write answers based on current affairs. Alright, moving on to specific topics. So first topic is India and its neighbors. So these are the PYQs of last few years. I have taken 3 PYQs. I have basically taken 3 PYQs and they are more or less enough for the purpose of understanding. They are more or less enough for the purpose of understanding. Just a minute, guys. These PYQs are more or less enough for you to understand what is the demand of UPSC from this particular topic. Hello Nadia. Hello Gajanan. Chalo. What is the first PYQ? First PYQ is basically with respect to Maldives. The question is, discuss the geopolitical and geostrategic importance of Maldives for India with a focus on global trade and energy flow. Further, also discuss how this relationship affects India's maritime security and regional stability amidst international competition. So when I look at this particular question now, what I understand is they are trying to ask me, UPSC is trying to ask me, what is the importance of Maldives for India? What is basically the importance of Maldives for India? That is what they are trying to ask me. If I look at the second question, now it is somewhat opposite. What is the second question? India is age-old friend of Sri Lanka. Discuss India's role in the recent crisis in Sri Lanka in the light of preceding statement. Okay, this question was asked when Sri Lanka was going through an imminent economic crisis. It is still going to economic crisis, but the problem has receded to a certain extent. Alright, it has receded to a certain extent. At that point of time, what we saw was it was under immense economic pressure, and at that point of time, India had extended the hand of help to Sri Lanka. So in this question, what is necessary or what is the demand of the question? Demand of the question is to showcase how India is important for Sri Lanka. Here, the demand of the question was how Maldives is important for India, and here the demand of the question is how India is important for Sri Lanka. Okay. Third question, China is using its economic relations and positive trade surplus as tool to develop potential military power status in Asia. In the light of this statement, discuss its impact on India as her neighbor. Now this is very important. ठीक है. Now this question na in a way it encapsulates the philosophy of IR as a subject for the purpose of mains examination. Why I am saying this is because from the point of view of IR, a general bird's eye view that you have to basically provide to the subject is, good evening Ravi, the general bird's eye view that has to be taken into consideration is how any event, how any act of a particular country, how any act of an international organization affects India. In the same way, you have to also understand how India affects any action at the global level, how India affects any reaction at a global level. ठीक है. So IR in totality is how India gets affected and how India affects. That's it. ठीक है, that's it. Any particular event in which India is getting directly affected, or any particular event by which India directly affects, world events, that becomes important. That has to be taken into focus. And this particular question basically is about it, how acts of one of its neighbors is basically affecting India. ठीक है. If we get into analysis of overall demand, मतलब this was at a macro level. Now if I get into micro level as to what is the demand of UPSC when it comes to the topic of India and its neighbors in specific what they want to know from me. This was an overall demand, how India gets affected and how India is affected. In specific, what has to more or less get into my answer, what will be more or less the points that I will write in my answer, whatever the question might be. ठीक है. These points will more or less be part of your answer. And what are they? Let us take them into consideration. विपिन कैसे करना है? अच्छा, हाँ, ओके, ठीक है. तो फर्स्ट demand of the question for India and its neighbor will be for you to understand if there is any bilateral agreement between India and its immediate neighbors. देखो, whenever you take into consideration India and its neighbor now, also understand there are two aspects of it. One is India's immediate neighborhood, that is the SAARC countries, alright, with which India has land borders or maritime borders. And second is India's extended neighborhood. When I say India's extended neighborhood, it is countries neighboring those countries which borders with India. Countries neighboring those countries which are bordering India, or countries that are in near vicinity of India. For example, countries of West Asia. For example, countries of East Asia. For example, countries of Central Asia. ठीक है. तो India and its neighbors now, it has to be taken into consideration. It has to be basically taken into consideration that it does not stop at the borders of SAARC. It does not stop at the borders of SAARC. But if I have to focus upon India and its neighbors as such, so the first point that you have to pay much more attention to is the bilateral treaties between India and its neighbors. If there is a bilateral treaty that has happened in the recent times, UPSC more or less will ask question on it. UPSC more or less will ask question on it. Don't worry, we will look into important topics. Basically, we will go through important topics that will help you in revising also. Second, crisis diplomacy and India's role as stabilizers. For example, Sri Lanka. When economic crisis took place in Sri Lanka, India basically acted as stabilizers. Okay, India basically acted as stabilizer. Now, why did India do so? India did so because India is in the position to do it. Dekho, the positioning, the status of India in its neighborhood in South Asia, okay, is such कि whether India likes it or India does not like it, India has to play the role of stabilizer. India basically has to play the role of stabilizer. All right. So, second aspect of the question will be from the point of view of how India stabilizes the region of South Asia. How India creates the situation that is oriented towards trade, oriented towards economic development, oriented towards peace. Third, internal politics of neighboring countries and their spillover effects on India. When the question basically is asked with respect to direct relations between India and its neighbors, or challenges that India faces, say with Nepal, India's relations with respect to Nepal, or India's relations with respect to Bangladesh. At that point of time, one of the pointers in your answer has to be internal politics of that country, or even internal politics of India, and how it basically affects bilateral relations between India and its neighbors. For example, India becomes a bashing point in Nepal during the time of election in that country. Alright, and what does it do? It to an extent creates obstacles in good relations between India and Nepal. Alright, moving ahead. Decline of SAARC. More than decline of SAARC, this I have taken into consideration from the point of view of PYQs. But if you take into account contemporary times, hello Neeraj, what do we see? What do we basically see? We see questions, the probability of the questions to be less oriented towards SAARC and more oriented towards BIMSTEC. Traditionally, the questions have been asked on SAARC. And when I say questions have been asked on SAARC, the orientation of the questions again has been from the point of view of why SAARC is not able to work as it should have been. That has been more or less the orientation of the question. Now, there is a growing possibility, because SAARC, India has in a way in its foreign policy outlook replaced SAARC with BIMSTEC. Now there is growing possibility. Now basically there is growing possibility of question being directly asked on BIMSTEC, and how BIMSTEC will act as a regional stabilizer, BIMSTEC will act as the engine of growth. And taking into consideration again crisis in Bangladesh, which is one of the core countries of BIMSTEC, the question, as I was telling you, the question might be oriented towards how BIMSTEC will be affected due to crisis in Bangladesh. How BIMSTEC basically will be impacted by the crisis in Bangladesh. Now, why I am speaking in favor of BIMSTEC, or why I think UPSC will move towards BIMSTEC? Reason for that is, in April or May this year itself, Prime Minister Modi had said that BIMSTEC is the most important regional organization at this point of time in the world. And UPSC does not unnotice such kind of statements. Obviously, then UPSC will want the future bureaucrats to know about BIMSTEC or have a working understanding of BIMSTEC. Then, when it comes to India and its neighborhood, one of the aspects has to be China. How India's relations, China is also a neighbor, so obviously India-China relations are in focus. But other than direct question on India-China relations, how China's growing footprint in South Asia, it impacts India's relations, say with Sri Lanka, or India's relations, say with Maldives, becomes very important. It basically becomes very important. One more thing, UPSC is known to not ask questions from one theme in succeeding years. For example, last year there was question on Maldives. There is a probability that this year there will not be a question on Maldives. Last year there was a question on Maldives, so this year there is a probability of question not being asked on Maldives this year. Other than this 5 pointers, I would say crisis between India and its neighboring countries become important, and this will become super important this year because of 2 countries. Now what we'll do is we'll get into what to expect, what questions to expect in the examination of 2025, mains examination of 2025. So let us look at expected line of questioning this year. So if there are any doubts, please let me know. Jai Shri Radhe Radhe Deepak. ऑपरेशन पवन, Gajanan, Operation Pavan and Palk Strait, देखो it depends upon the focus of the question. ठीक है, rarely UPSC what it does is it will ask you umbrella question in IR or in any subject for that matter, but more so in IR. In IR what they will do is they will ask you specific question. So if question has to be asked on Sri Lanka at this point of time now, it will be from the point of view of economic cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. Economic cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. Reason for that is India and Sri Lanka are engaging at multiple levels. For example, cooperation in fintechs. ठीक है, India's assistance to Sri Lanka in IMF. Growing Indian tourist in Sri Lanka. ठीक है, so that will be the orientation of questions. A general question is rather rare. ठीक है, in this day and age, a general question on India's relation with a certain country, now that is rare. What will happen is a specific pointer will be asked. ठीक है, हाँ, there could be a question on challenges, overall challenges with respect to a particular question, with respect to a particular country. But when we talk about positive aspect, now in positive aspect, what will happen is they will talk about a particular sector. They will basically talk about a particular sector. All right. I guess there are no doubts, so I will move ahead. I will basically move ahead. Yes, we have signed 3 MOUs with Maldives, Gajanan. But the thing is that now, as I told you, because last year itself there was question on Maldives, I suspect that there is lesser possibility of Maldives being asked this year. I am not saying that UPSC will not at all ask, but I suspect that there is a very little possibility of question being asked on Maldives. All right. In fact, there is greater probability of question being asked on FTA between India and Britain. There is greater probability of question being asked on FTA between India and Britain, and reason for that is that on Britain for many years now there has been no question. ठीक है, so this particular FTA, the background of this particular FTA, na, it gives a ground for, it basically provides a possibility for a question being asked on India-Britain FTA. Chalo. No problem, we'll move forward and let us look into expected topics now and let us discuss those topics to a certain extent. Obviously, full-fledged discussion is not possible, but it will refresh your memory. And those writing next year, it will basically give you pointers on what to focus upon for at the time of reading. So 2 countries I will say are important in India's neighborhood this year. First is Pakistan. When I say Pakistan is important, obviously it is important because of negative reasons, whatever the case might be. A horrific incident happened in Pulwama, but we have to see it from the point of view of syllabus, and we have to see it from the point of view of what basically UPSC is expecting us to know. First, take into consideration the Pulwama attack. And as response to Pulwama attack, of course, the question will be on Operation Sindoor. Question might be on Operation Sindoor. We'll discuss it to a certain extent. Again, I am saying don't worry. And in the midst of this, what came into highlight? 2 treaties. Indus Water Treaty and then Simla Agreement. So if the question is asked on Pakistan now, if the question basically is asked on Pakistan, it will be more or less on these 4 pointers. ठीक है? When it comes to Pulwama attack, obviously what has to be your focal point, how Pulwama attack has basically impacted relations between India and Pakistan. So they have obviously damaged relations. What it has done is, it has even squeezed people to people diplomacy or track to diplomacy. All right. What it has further done? It has created hindrances in possibility of trade relations between India and Pakistan to be booming. It has created a situation where bare minimum expectations have to be fulfilled by Pakistan for the purpose of basically India-Pakistan relations getting back on track again, or initiations for India-Pakistan relations being on track again are developed. ठीक है, इसमें क्रिकेट भी डालो, इसमें सिनेमा भी डालो, those relations are also impacted. Those relations basically are also impacted. What it has also done is it has brought into focus Indus Water Treaty. It has brought into focus India's water treaty and a strong stance with respect to India. A strong stance from the point of view of India with respect to the philosophy that blood and water cannot flow together is pursued or is received. It is received. As far as Simla agreement is concerned, which Pakistan has suspended, suppose there is a question on Indus Water Treaty or on Simla agreement per se. ठीक है, both of them, specific question with respect to these two, that is very rare. What may happen is these 2 points basically can become an indication, or these 2 points basically can become part of a larger question from the point of view of Pulwama attack affecting India-Pakistan relations. Pulwama attack basically affecting India-Pakistan relations. ठीक है, with respect to Indian Water Treaty, it has to be mentioned that India becomes well within its right to basically utilize provisions for the purpose of restricting the flow of water into Pakistan. With respect to Simla agreement basically is effectively preserved, and Simla agreement is effectively what you can say is will be taken forward. The reason for that is one of the main provisions of Simla agreement is LOC has to be considered effective border till the final solution of the Kashmir dispute. ठीक है, if LOC is not considered to be pursued border or ad hoc border between India and Pakistan, that means LOC does not exist. All right, that also basically means the international border between India and Pakistan, or the border between Kashmir and Pakistan, is basically the border between India and Pakistan. Through Simla agreement, what was agreed upon, this is ceasefire line, this is ad hoc boundary between India and Pakistan. All right, so if Pakistan backtracks from the Simla agreement, what it effectively means is LOC does not exist. That means it actually certifies India's position, that is Pakistan illegally occupying some part of Kashmir. All right, so effect of Simla agreement with respect to India-Pakistan relations has to be negligible. They will be negligible. Simla agreement has to be agreed upon by Pakistan, even if they say that they are backing themselves out of Simla agreement. All right, Operation Sindoor. What has Operation Sindoor basically showcased about Indian foreign policy, or how it will affect India and Pakistan relation? देखो, as far as Operation Topak is concerned, or bleeding India by 100 wounds is concerned, or 1000 wounds is concerned, or Pakistan's orientation towards using terrorism as a foreign policy initiative, as far as that is concerned, now it is still not known. It is basically still not known whether it will be taken forward or not. ठीक है, so there is basically no guarantee that Operation Sindoor, what it will do is it will result into Operation Sindoor will result into no further terrorist activities from Pakistan into India. But what it has suggested also is there will be no normalcy. There will be no normalcy in the backdrop of terrorist activities being conducted in India by Pakistan. ठीक है. Second, it may create international pressure on Pakistan it may create international pressure on Pakistan to not abide by its policies of sponsoring terrorism into India. Why? Because even a skirmish between India and Pakistan, because both of them are nuclear power states, creates shivers around the world. It creates panic around the world. All right. Third point from the backdrop of Operation Sindoor is the positioning of Pakistan in Kashmir is not strengthened but weakened through Operation Sindoor. It is not strengthened but weakened through Operation Sindoor. All right. Moving ahead, the second country that I will say is important from this year's point of view is Nepal. Hello, Ria. The next country that is important from the point of view of India's neighborhood, I will say, is Nepal. And what has to be taken into consideration when it comes to Nepal? What are the expected topics when it comes to Nepal? So the first topic will be basically on border disputes. Though open discussion on border disputes or open damage between India and Nepal has not happened at least this year. From the point of view of border disputes. Still, border dispute has to be one of the points. If the question is on problems between India and Nepal. Okay. And now I give you homework. List down the areas in which there exist border disputes between India and Nepal. That you have to find out. That basically you have to find out. Other than this, what is also important is connectivity. Connectivity projects that are taking place between India and Nepal. And third, when I talk about connectivity, now the extension of connectivity or the extension of infrastructural joint efforts is electricity. How collaboration in energy sector between India and Nepal is helping the two countries to bond a stronger relations between them, to bond basically a stronger relation between them. Okay. Also, from the point of view of Nepal, religion as a base of religion as a base of relation has to be highlighted. Buddhist diplomacy, or for that matter, Hindu diplomacy. Okay. Hindu diplomacy or Buddhist diplomacy, what it has done is it has created another avenue. It has basically created another avenue, for example, extending infrastructural development between India and Nepal so that Nepali Hindus could reach out to Hindu places of worships in the states mainly of Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. What it has done is it has boosted the relations between India and Nepal. The same goes with respect to Buddhist tourism. The same basically goes with respect to Buddhist tourism. Moving ahead, Bhutan. I'll come to Bangladesh. Bhutan. Bhutan. Progress made through infrastructure projects assisted by India. Infrastructure projects assisted by India. All right, that will be the first point, including Gelupu city, which is obviously expected to bring economic development to Bhutan and also enhance India's connectivity to Bhutan and India's connectivity to itself through that particular city, and also bring economic development to those parts of India which are bordering Bhutan. All right, Gelupu city, it is the world's first sustainably developed city. So it has to be part of your answer. It basically has to be part of your answer. Providing energy corridor between Bhutan and Bangladesh through which Bhutan earns revenue or Bhutan's GDP grows. Assisting Bhutan in building sustainably development hydropower projects has to be again part of your answer. Bhutan, India, Bangladesh trilateral energy corridor. Bhutan, India, Bangladesh trilateral energy corridor is in talks, and it will again benefit Bhutan and Bangladesh more. It will again benefit Bhutan and Bangladesh more. And India will be in a way bridge for this particular development. India will act as a catalyst for this particular development. So this more or less, I will say are the topics that are important for the purpose of India and its neighbors. Coming to Bangladesh, if I have to look into Bangladesh now, what will be expected when it comes to Bangladesh? What should be expected when it comes to Bangladesh? First and foremost, deterioration of relations. Deterioration of relations between India and Bangladesh. One way in which we could see that is Indian companies being discouraged to carry out their activities in Bangladesh. Second way of looking at it is an invitation to China, in a way invitation to China to work in the economic spectrum of Bangladesh. Bangladesh balancing between India and China, to an extent what has been seen, the same not being continued, the same policy not being continued. Okay. Other aspect would be from the point of view of minorities in Bangladesh. From the point of view of minorities in Bangladesh. Okay. The way in which news of persecution of minorities comes to India from Bangladesh, what do we take into consideration? What has to be taken into consideration? Safety of minorities in India, so that retaliation against them does not happen. So that retaliation against them does not happen. Third aspect from the point of view of Bangladesh is trade relations between India and Bangladesh being affected. Fourth, fear of insurgency. Fear of insurgency again being supported. Fear of insurgency again being supported by the government in Dhaka. For many years during the type of Sheikh Hasina, what did we see? This policy was not basically followed. This policy basically was not followed. Now the fear of insurgency rises again. And therefore, India at this point of time is on tenterhooks. Last, I will say from the point of view of Bangladesh. What is at stake? Regional stability. For many years, Bangladesh acted as example to other countries from the point of view of a stable South Asian nation. From the point of view of being a stable South Asian nation. Now the same cannot be provided for. The same cannot be provided from. Of course, other than India, it was a stable South Asian country. Okay, now the same cannot be provided for. Alright. What is likely for UPSC to take into consideration? What is basically likely for UPSC to take into consideration when it comes to asking you questions, specific questions? So first I will say bilateral diplomacy and water sharing. And water sharing to be one of the tools. That aspect can be taken into consideration. That aspect can come up. Second, I will say cross-border terrorism and how it has affected India's relations with its neighbors, especially Pakistan. The same also can be connected to insurgent groups finding heavens in Bangladesh. And lastly, I will say Lastly, I will say utility of neighborhood first policy in the light of trust deficit and strategic cooperation. In the light of trust deficit and strategic cooperation. Now look, when it basically comes to India and its neighbors now, there are certain initiatives that you have to mention. Okay? And one of them is neighborhood first policy. With respect to Pakistan, of course, neighborhood first policy you will not be able to apply. Okay? Because Indian foreign policy makers, even though at the time of making this policy, now Pakistan was into consideration, but later obviously what happened was we did not consider Pakistan under this policy. But if the question is on Nepal, if the question is on Bangladesh, if the question is on Sri Lanka, there is a possibility of neighborhood first policy being part of your answer, and you have to make it, and you have to basically make it part of your answer. Second is, when it comes to maritime neighbors of India, for example Sri Lanka, for example Maldives, Sagar initiative, or rather now Mahasagar initiative has to be part of your answer. Mahasagar initiative has to be basically part of your answer. Alright, moving ahead now guys, moving ahead and looking into the next topic. What type of question can we expect from Operation Sindoor? Should we expect a full-fledged question on it, or should we come under? Okay, so Unnati is asking what type of question can we basically expect from Operation Sindoor. So Unnati, देखो, I expect a specific question. When I say specific question, na, I say कि what will be the impact of Operation Sindoor on relations between India and Pakistan. Okay, some points we have already discussed. What will be the impact of Operation Sindoor on relations between India and Pakistan? There are only two possibilities if the question is basically asked on India and its, if the question is asked on relations between India and Pakistan. One is the after effects of Pulwama, how attacks like Pulwama will navigate relations between India and Pakistan. Obviously, they will not take the relations between India and Pakistan anywhere. You have to show that in different aspects, be it sports, be it cultural relations, be it diplomatic relations, be it economic relations. Alright, that has to be first and foremost, showcased. In that particular question, you have to also mention about Operation Topak. Okay, you have to also mention about Operation Topak. What you could also do is you can show the series of terrorist activities that were launched in India from the Pakistani soil, be it 26/11, be it Mumbai train blast case, be it Delhi serial blast case. So you have to basically mention Uri attack. Okay, you have to basically give a sequence to it. You have to basically give a sequence to it. Okay, you have to also mention what is the intention of Pakistan. You have to also mention what is basically the intention of Pakistan when it comes to following this particular policy. And lastly, I will say you have to then elaborate upon the after effects of it. Questions will be asked on after effect only. Okay. There is a very rare possibility, in fact that may happen in PSIR, that the question is asked on why Pakistan undertakes this particular, a question on why Pakistan basically undertakes this particular initiative, undertakes this particular policy. On that, the question is very rare. Why? Because it will move into the domain of internal politics of Pakistan. Alright, it will move more into the domain of internal policies of Pakistan. Now, the second question that can be expected from India-Pakistan relation this year is Operation Sindoor and aftermath of Operation Sindoor. So, what is the aftermath of Operation Sindoor? Aftermath of Operation Sindoor is halt on relations between India and Pakistan from fostering, or halt on any initiative that will positively affect India and Pakistan relations. All right, what has Operation Sindoor basically done? It has almost cut down diplomatic relations between India and Pakistan, and it has almost stopped any good initiative from coming on the negotiating table. What has Operation Sindoor also done? It has created a situation where one of the best, I will say, one of the best executed bilateral treaties by India has been damaged, and that is Indus Water Treaty. And also Simla Agreement, but Simla Agreement they have broken it. You can mention about that also, no problem with respect to that. But it will not have so many ramifications. It does not have so many ramifications on India as it has on Pakistan. Okay. So you can mention that as a point. But Indus Water Treaty, now, Indus Water Treaty, because it is an action taken by us, it requires more attention. It basically requires more attention. Okay. What it also does, it brings or it reiterates that terrorism is the core issue when it comes to India-Pakistan relations. There is difference of opinion, difference of perception between India and Pakistan when it comes to the core issue between them. Pakistan considers Kashmir to be the core issue. India considers terrorism to be the core issue. Pakistan considers because Kashmir is an issue, terrorism has become an issue. And India states that because terrorism is happening, talks on Kashmir cannot happen. Talks on Kashmir basically cannot happen. So what Operation Sindoor does is, it brings or reiterates India's position even further. That first there will be focus on terrorism, and then there may be talk on Kashmir. Okay, that is what basically Operation Sindoor does. That is what basically Operation Sindoor does. Operation Sindoor, what it also does is, if we go beyond relations between India and Pakistan, it focuses or pushes us towards better border management. It pushes us towards better border management. All right. Okay. Unnati, if there is anything else, so please let me know. Gajanan has asked, sir, recently, yesterday, there has been cultural development between India and Mongolia, 5 countries because of Buddhist stupa made in Bihar government, especially. Absolutely, that has to go in your answer. Buddhist diplomacy, as far as possible, has to be mentioned in your answer. And Buddhism as a binding factor. You can connect it to many countries in the world. Okay. So what Gajanan has stated, cultural ties with respect to Buddhism or on the basis of Buddhism, that have to be taken forward, that have to be answered to, that have to be written without any doubt. Okay. Anything else? If there is anything else, please let me know. Deepak, Neeraj, Arun. Chalo. Now let us move to the second pointer in the syllabus, bilateral, regional, global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interest. Okay. So again, any grouping of which India is or is not a part. Okay. If it is a part, if India is part of any grouping, probability of question being asked on that grouping is more because India is directly affected. If India is not part of any grouping, for example, Organization of Islamic States or Organization of Islamic Countries, India is not part of that particular grouping, but if any decision of that grouping affects India eminently, then there is a possibility of question being asked on that grouping. Again, the philosophy is clear. Is India getting affected or is India affecting? If there are these two possibilities, then the question will be asked. Yesterday someone was asking me, is there a possibility of question being asked on border disputes that are happening in East Asia between Cambodia and Thailand? I would say very rare. Why? Because India is neither affecting that dispute or India is neither in a big way getting affected by that dispute. Okay, yes, India will be affected in some way, but it is not as direct or not as impactful as I will say Russian-Ukrainian war. Okay, or the issue between Hamas and Israel. So if we are not in that way getting directly affected, if we are not getting directly affected, the possibility of question being asked is rare. Okay. So here there are again 4 questions that I have taken up for general understanding. First question is, critically analyze India's diplomatic, economic, strategic relations with Central Asian republics. Highlight their increasing significance in regional and global politics. इंक्रीजिंग सिग्निफिकेंस इन रीजनल एंड ग्लोबल पॉलिटिक्स. देखो ऑब्वियस क्वेश्चन है. फर्स्ट मतलब यू वांट टू नो कि विथ रिस्पेक्ट टू अ पर्टिकुलर ग्रुपिंग what type of relation has India engaged in with, and to what extent there is depth in that relation. And when it comes to relation with any country or relation with any grouping or relation with any region, na, which are the aspects that you will cover? Diplomatic, economic and strategic. यही तो तीन है. ठीक है, कल्चरल एस्पेक्ट्स वगैरह आर ऑल्सो देयर, बट मेनली यूपीएससी इज इंटरेस्टेड इन दिस. देखो मोस्टली ना व्हेन इट कम्स टू कल्चरल एस्पेक्ट्स, कल्चरल एस्पेक्ट rarely as an independent question is asked. It becomes a pointer which is, I would say, an add-on. मतलब you are writing your answer in evolving diplomatic, economic and strategic relations. When it comes to diplomatic relations now, or even when it means to economic relations, there you can add up cultural aspect. ठीक है, cultural aspect that you can basically do, that you can, my dear friends, basically do. So any grouping you understand, you have to understand on the basis of these three pillars. Second question, how will I2U2 grouping transform India's position in global politics? This question was, मतलब it was those questions ना, it was like मतलब एक simple catch जैसे क्रिकेट में होता है. ठीक है, it was a lollipop question. I2U2 3 or 4 months before the mains examination was formed, and there was certainty. There was almost a certainty that the question will be asked on this particular organization or this particular grouping, and the question was asked on that grouping. ठीक है, and again it was a simple question कि how it will affect India's positioning, how it will basically affect India's positioning. So what it will do, it will in a way bring India closer to the three countries, and there will be economic initiatives, there will be strategic initiatives, there will be a concentrated effort to increase India's footprint and therefore not being outmaneuvered by China. More or less that had to be the direction you will take. It will provide impetus to India when it comes to its strategy of developing supply chain management. ठीक है. Fourth question, in the last few decades, if the last few decades were of Asia's growth story, the next few are expected to be Africa's. In the light of this statement, examine India's influence in Africa in recent years. This is, I will say, quite an old question, but Africa remains important to us. Africa basically remains important to us. So from the point of Africa, what has to be taken into consideration? From the point of Africa, we have to take into consideration how India influences the growth of Africa, how India, through its presence in Africa, through its work in Africa, what it is doing is, it is showcasing South-South cooperation. It is basically showcasing South-South cooperation. Okay, that has to be shown by you. And again, you have to showcase how Africa is important for India. For example, the human resource of Africa, the land resource of Africa, the mineral resources of Africa, the natural resources of Africa. Africa as a continent which has the potential to be a bridge between India and Europe, in a way that has been done by IMEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor, India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor. Obviously, okay, Middle East is a factor over there, but Africa will be taken into consideration, or Africa will be added to it. And Africa, basically speaking, now the potential that Africa has to be a bridge for us, when it comes to our relations with Europe. All right. Then Quad ke upar question. Quad is transforming itself into a trading bloc from a military alliance in present time. Discuss. So you have to showcase that Quad was never a military alliance as such. Maybe it was a military alliance before India joined. Maybe it was a military alliance before it was actually Quad. Quad basically means 4 countries. So it may have had military intentions before India basically joined it. But more or less, India is oriented towards economic cooperation, and through economic cooperation, what it intends to do? It intends to keep alive keep alive freedom of navigation in the areas of East Asia or in the areas of South China Sea. Okay, in the areas of South China Sea, that has to be showcased from this particular. That has to be showcased from this particular question. Also, what has to be showcased? How keeping the freedom of navigation alive. How keeping the freedom of navigation alive through what affects India, and how India basically affects the South China Sea through what. Okay, again these pointers will come into act. Again these particular pointers will be important. Again these two particular pointers will be important. Moving on now, guys, to overall demand. First is you have to take into consideration India's evolving engagement with emerging groups. Question on UN may be rare now, or question of India's engagement say with International Labour Organization. Those questions are there. Question will now be oriented towards contemporary organizations. They will now be oriented towards contemporary organizations. Organizations like SCO, organizations like Quad, organizations like I2U2. And because of the developments that have happened in BRICS last years, organizations like BRICS. BRICS is important this year. BRICS as an organization is important this year. Why is BRICS important this year? BRICS is important this year because we have added new members to BRICS. Because despite problems between India and China, what we have seen is BRICS making progress. Despite problems between India and China, we see BRICS making progress. BRICS making progress in which aspects? Cultural aspect, sustainable development aspect, economic aspect. So that has to be stated. Last year question was not asked on BRICS, but this year there is probability of the question being asked. IR may sometimes what happens is whatever happens last year, whatever happens just before last mains, that also comes up. That may also come up. That may also become a line of inquiry. Moving on, strategic balancing between competing poles, how India balances itself. How India basically balances itself when it comes to different countries. For example, India balancing itself between US and Russia, or India balancing itself between China and the West, or India balancing itself between Islamic countries of West Asia and Israel. Alright, here what has to be priority? Here what has to be stated? First and foremost, India's policy of strategic autonomy. Non-alignment movement, don't write it, because now we use the term strategic autonomy. Okay. Second thing, what has to be taken into consideration when we think about strategic autonomy? It is India's national interest. And you have to write from the point of view of national interest with particulars. For example, if we talk about India balancing between Israel and the countries of Islamic countries of West Asia, obviously you have to showcase how Israel is important for us from technical scientific point of view, from agricultural productivity ka point of view, and how West Asian countries are important to us from the point of view of our energy security. Okay. Second example, if I may use, if it comes to India balancing between US and Russia, then what we have to take into consideration? We have to take into consideration how Russia continues to be one of our sources of defense requirements and plus cheap source of our hydrocarbons. In the same way, relationship with US is based upon market liberalization and economic growth. And also it also is oriented towards defense cooperation. It is also oriented towards defense cooperation, scientific cooperation. Alright, so you have to show what is the reason for India balancing. You have to also showcase that India's decision to align with a particular country is based upon India's requirement rather than requirement of some other country. ठीक है? So that has to be basically showcased by you. India's role in Indo-Pacific and Continental Asia. Continental Asia, Indo-Pacific, I don't think this year it is that important. This year, West Asia becomes very important to us. This year, West Asia basically becomes very important to us. In fact, how troubles in West Asia basically impact India. Question might be oriented from that particular end. ठीक है? Energy diplomacy and trade convergence, we'll talk about it in some time. Institutional utility and shaping of India's multilateral and bilateral leverages. Again, we will take into consideration with specific examples. Now let us go to expected areas from where questions might be asked this year. और यहाँ से हम लोग देखेंगे about these pointers and how the demand of the question has to be more or less met by you. Let me have some water, guys. If there are any questions, please go ahead. If there are any questions, please go ahead, guys. Okay. I shall move ahead then. Let us look into the topics on which questions might be asked. So when it comes to bilateral relations or grouping wala relations or regional relations, now as I told you, West Asia becomes very important for us. More or less the pointers on which the questions might be asked is obviously relation between Israel and Hamas, relation between Israel and Iran, and how it affects us. Okay. So how it basically affects us? It affects our energy security. It makes our energy sources expensive. It affects our energy security. Second, what it also does is it creates a situation where West Asia as a region becomes difficult to trade with. So not only it is with respect to energy security, but it is also with respect to overall economic and trading relations with the region that come under stress. It creates a situation where balancing for India becomes tough. It creates a situation which may lead to internal disturbance in the country. It may lead to a situation that creates problem when it comes to internal disturbance of the country. It creates a situation where Indian diaspora will be impacted. It creates a situation where Indian diaspora is affected. And lastly, it creates a situation where our ideals of global peace is impacted. Our ideal of global peace is basically impacted. Okay. If the question then is asked what India has to do from the point of view of disturbance in West Asia, be it Gaza and Israel or be it Iran and Israel. Dekho, do not mention that India should directly get into negotiations or India should directly conciliate play a role of a conciliar between Iran and Israel or a conciliar between Israel and Hamas, because that is not our official positioning. When it comes to Hamas, Indian government basically has stated that act of terrorism cannot be tolerated and act of terrorism will not be supported by government of India. Okay. When it comes to situation in Gaza, yes, diplomatically what has to be done is humanitarian aid. ठीक है, humanitarian aid may be asked to be provided to the people of Gaza. ठीक है, other thing, India's stand with respect to any international dispute is requesting the countries or appealing to the countries to get to negotiating tables. ठीक है, to get to negotiating tables. Do not write that we have to be counselors between the countries, because India does not accept it to be the role. Neither global community sees India to be in that particular role. All right, neither global community sees itself to be in that particular role. Also, what has to be mentioned by you is dehyphenating our relations with one country with that of other country. For example, there basically should not be a zero-sum game, and this has to be mentioned by you. There should not be a zero-sum game when it comes to India's relations with different countries. So it is not as if because we have good relations with Israel, we cannot have good relations with Islamic countries of West Asia. In the same way, because we have good relations with Islamic countries of West Asia, or because we believe in the right of Palestinian peoples to have their own state, it does not mean that we will not have good relations with Israel. So not having zero-sum game from the point of view of relations between countries is important and has to be stated by you, and basically has to be stated by you. There could be a condition where importance of West Asia might be asked to you, so I have written them down. And when it comes to West Asia, when it basically comes to West Asia, or when it basically comes to Iran, also what has to be done by you is connectivity of India with Central Asia has to be stated by you. It has to be mentioned by you, it has to be showcased by you. Okay. West Asia now is also important to us because it acts as a connective link between India and different parts of the world, most importantly Central Asia and Europe. After IMEC, okay, that is India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So this was from the point of view of West Asia. Okay. Engagement, strategic engagement or strategic investments from UAE and Saudi Arabia in Indian ports and digital economy of India has to be also mentioned by you. And lastly, I will say expansion of engagement between India and Gulf Cooperation Council has to be again highlighted. It has to be again highlighted. Coming to another region that has not been in focus of UPSC, but this year again the activity is happening in this region. What it may do is it may encourage UPSC to ask question of India's relations with East Asia. Now when it comes to East Asia, again there are specifics when it comes to relations with Japan, say Japan or South Korea or Philippines, but what do we also see is overall East Asia being part of the news rather than a country being part of the news. I repeat, East Asia as a region has been more part of news rather than specific countries of East Asia being part of the news. Hence, as a region, there is a greater possibility that as a region, question might be asked on East Asia. Okay, this year. And when it comes to that, obviously what you have to do is you have to mention about India's relations to East Asia as a whole and then particular countries. Okay, so you have to mention India's relations with East Asia as a whole and then particular countries. Okay, East Asia as a whole, what do we see? Booming economic relations. Okay, there is upward trend when it comes to economic relations and the countries of East Asia. One common factor, China. One common factor, ambition of both India and East Asian countries to create global supply chain. Again, attitude of India and East Asia countries for India to be made part of RCEP. Okay, what does it do? It converges the interest of India and East Asia. One more factor is the China factor. India and East Asian countries do not want do not want muscle flexing of China. They want, what do they basically want? They want freedom of navigation in South China Sea. They want basically freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Hurdles with respect to India and East Asian countries or East Asia as a region? Not enough economic engagement. India and East Asia have not engaged with each other to an extent that they should have. On the other hand, what do we see with respect to Southeast Asia? We see greater economic engagement. We basically see greater economic engagement. So this is the first problem between, I will say, India and East Asia. Second is, even if these countries are not oriented towards China, or even if these countries do feel muscle flexing of China to be a problem, what do we see? They engaging with China. And therefore their ability to maneuver with India becomes limited, because they are so much into trading relations with China. Now their ability to maneuver with India, that becomes limited. That basically becomes limited. Another handicap when it comes to India and East Asia relation, again you can draw a parallel from Southeast Asia, is lack of effective diaspora in the countries of East Asia. Indian diaspora in the countries of East Asia. What does it do? It does not provide a strong foundation, or I would say a strong bridge, for improving relations between India and the countries of East Asia. Now if I look into specific countries, now India and Japan is important. There can also be a possibility of specific question being asked on India and Japan, not only on East Asia but India and Japan. Why? Because both the countries have agreed to revise focus on cooperation between the two countries, especially on the backdrop of digital partnership. Especially on the backdrop of digital partnership and Indo-Pacific infrastructure. Also, these two countries been part of Quad. If a question is asked, if question basically is asked on a country now, and you have to write how these countries cooperate with each other, you have written about strategic relations, economic relations, economic relations, diplomatic relations. One more aspect that you can add is, one more aspect that basically you can add to the spectrum is how these countries relate to each other, how these countries basically relate to each other on regional platforms. How these countries basically relate to each other on regional platforms or on global platforms. So if the question is on, say, India and South Africa relations, now BRICS has to come in. BRICS basically has to come in. In the same way, if the question is asked on India-Japan relations, now Quad will come in. Because that is one of the glues of relations between India and Japan. That is one of the glues between the relations between India and Japan. Second country that I would mention, on which an overall pointer can be developed. If the question is on overall East Asia, now pointer can be written on this country, and that is South Korea. That basically is South Korea. Now, why South Korea is becoming important? In fact, Taiwan also. But why South Korea is so important for us? And in fact, again I am repeating, this is the same reason why Taiwan becomes important for us, and that is defense production. Defense production and semiconductors. And semiconductor supply chain. Also, when it comes to East Asia, as I told you, China factor has to come in. More or less, China factor has to come in. Moving on now, guys. To yes. So as Gajanan is saying, as Gajanan is saying, Indians are highly appreciative of Korean movies. Indians are highly appreciative of Korean movies, which basically boost their economy. So if the question is on India Korea, and even if the question is not on India Korea, if it is overall on East Asia and how relations between India and East Asia have improved or what are the reasons for it, in that cultural aspect, movies and cultural aspects of it can be stated. Not only Korean movies which are popular in India, or Korean, it is not about Korean TV shows that are popular in India. It is also that the content of Indian cinemas has been appreciated in the countries of East Asia like Japan. So that can also be mentioned by you. So for example, RRR became one of the highest grossing movies in the countries of East Asia, especially in the countries of Japan and South Korea. So that can be mentioned by you under the angle of cultural relations, Shall we move on? If there are any other questions, please let me know. So Gajanan, you are watching these movies rather than studying. Okay, now let us come to the next topic, effect of policy and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interest, and of course there is extension to it, and that is Indian diaspora. Question on diaspora this year could be eminent, especially when it comes to Indian diaspora in United States, after taking into consideration the policies of Donald Trump. देखो, question been asked on India. I was joking, Gajanan, don't worry. Question been asked on India and its relations with America. Question been asked on this relation. India-US relation is eminent this year. And why I basically say that it is eminent this year? The reason for that is the policies of Donald Trump and also the noises that Donald Trump has been making, especially when it comes to ceasefire between India and Pakistan. Tariff relations, how that will affect India-US relations in general. That will come into focus. Trump's orientation towards immigrants, that will come into focus because that will affect our diaspora or our potential diaspora. That will come into focus, and it will also impact our economic growth. Obviously, it will impact our economic growth. Obviously, what it will also do is, it will impact our relations with other countries. For example, United States taking tough stand on tariffs when it comes to China as well as when it comes to India. What it has done is, it has led to India and China to an extent unfreezing their relation. Unfreezing their relation. वही है ना? Right. So let us look into the PYQs. The West is fostering India as an alternative to reduce dependence on China's supply chain, and as a strategy to counter China's political and economic dominance. Now, this was the question asked when United States was moving towards maintaining liberalized world economy with the strategy of countering China. The situation now has changed. Basically changed. In fact, the question that I expect this year is how India-China relations will be impacted, or what will be the navigation of India-China relations based upon the tariff policy of United States. What will happen is, basically India and China will have to resolve their disputes, because both the countries will have to if the tariff plan goes forward, or even if it does not get forward, and even if there is or even if there is basically growing talk over it, India and China will have to find alternatives to the quantum of trade that happens, to their quantum of trade that happens with United States. And obviously one of the alternatives for both of them is each other. Okay, one of the alternatives is each other. So India-China relations in the cloud of or in the background of Trump's tariff policies are bound to get better, are basically bound to get better. Now what you have to mention in that particular answer, how they are bound to get better. What are the arenas through which they are bound to get better. Alright. Second, explain this statement with example. India's diaspora has scaled new heights in the West. Describe its economic and political benefits for India. Obviously then you have to mention, when it comes to examples, you have to mention about Vikram Pandit, you have to mention about Indira Nooyi, you have to mention about people like Rishi Sunak, Kamala Harris, how these members of Indian diaspora or people like them, what have they done is they have basically created their own image, and through it India's image, which becomes a connecting link between India and those countries, which basically becomes a connective link between India and those particular countries. Alright, that basically was the demand of the question. Third, clean energy is the order of the day. Describe briefly India's changing policy towards climate change in various international fora in the context of geopolitics. Okay. So obviously, how the decisions of developed countries or even developing countries for that matter towards climate change, how they affect India's relations, that more or less was the demand of the question. Moving towards knowing overall what is needed to be known or what is needed to be written by you. So first thing that you have to understand when you read about effects of policies and politics of other countries, basically what has to be needed, what is needed by you to be known, geopolitical shift in global power blocks or change in understanding of geopolitics and geoeconomics, change in perception of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Before Trump basically coming to power, what did we see? We see a different understanding of geoeconomics. We saw India being in a way champion of liberalized world in South Asia. And it was seen as counter to China. In Trump era, the same might not be true. As China may be more affected by Trump's tariff policies, but India also stands affected. Second is the aspect of sanctions on Russia. Sanctions on India maybe, not Russia. The aspects of sanctions on India for trading with Russia. What it is bound to do? It is bound to create new economic relations of India with the countries like China. Alright, so geoeconomics has to be taken into consideration from the point of view of contemporary times. Second, rise of China and how it challenges India's space globally. Very important. Here, of course, you have to mention China's BRI. And in response to that, India taking up initiatives like Quad, India being part of I2U2, India taking up initiatives like Project Mosam. Third, India's climate diplomacy, energy security and technology dependence. In this, you have to basically mention how India believes in shared responsibility. When it comes to climate change as a tool of diplomacy, you have to orient yourself towards showcasing that India believes in shared responsibility, but also differentiated responsibility. India believes in equity when it basically comes to sharing responsibility to counter climate change. And even after that, what you have to showcase, You have to showcase the provisions of Paris Agreement and how India is sharing more than its required amount of responsibility. More than its required amount of responsibility. ठीक है. Then coming to economic and political role of Indian diaspora in global influence building. देखो, if this year question is asked now on diaspora, I do not think it will be asked on strengths of Indian diaspora. थोड़ा सा rare है, because this year we do not see Indian diaspora. This year basically we have not seen Indian diaspora being in news that much. ठीक है, being in news that much positively. What may happen is problems of Indian diaspora in West Asia might be taken into consideration. ठीक है, might be taken into consideration. Then impact of global crisis on Indian interests. So American orientation towards Iran, American orientation towards Russia, Russia's orientation towards Ukraine, how it affects India's interest, how it basically affects India's interest, that becomes the point of debate. Most of the points with respect to expected topics we have already discussed, but again, for the sake of revision, what I will say is, if you are basically looking at hot topics on which questions might be asked, so first is US tariffs. On Indian goods. What impact it will have? First and foremost, it will obviously affect India's economic growth. Higher tariffs on steels, textiles and pharma under section 301. What it will do is, it will basically impact India's economic growth, India's trading relations overall and with US specifically. What it will also do is, it will push India on developing better trading relations with other countries, so that the quantum of trade affected by these provisions of US can be compensated. Obviously, one of the countries that will take into consideration is China. ठीक है. Also, US tariffs on Indian goods have to be seen in the backdrop of WTO and the relations between that organization and India. ठीक है, WTO and the relation between that organization and India. Also, US tariff on Indian goods, it has to be taken into consideration, or it has to be seen in the backdrop of India's orientation towards building better supply chain management, India's orientation towards developing even better relations between the countries of global south. So they are not dependent upon one pole of power. They are not dependent upon one economic superpower, or they are not dependent upon one country overwhelmingly for its economic growth and development. Other policy of a country that is extremely important this year, and there is a great possibility of question to be asked on it, is India United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement. India UK Free Trade Agreement. इतना पड़ा है ना यूक्रेन for the last 3 years, वही आ रहा है. Okay. In this particular question, what should be your orientation? Your orientation obviously should be towards main provisions of the agreement, and mentioning that it is an important step towards better relations between India and Britain or India and UK. Also, what has to be taken into consideration when you write an answer towards this free trade agreement is acceptance of digital protection. Acceptance of digital protection to be part of free trade agreement between India and UK. That is an aspect which was originally not part of India's free trade agreement with any country. This is perhaps one of the first times when digital protection has been taken into consideration. India-UK free trade agreement is also acceleration of negotiation between India and UK. When it comes to conclusion of the free trade agreement, it is also on the backdrop of US tariff का orientation. ठीक है, also in the backdrop of tariff orientation of US. There are some aspects on which obviously advancement has to be done between India and UK when it comes to the free trade agreement. Obviously this free trade agreement, it is not as if done and dusted. There will be amendments to it in the future. Alright, and what are the areas in which India and UK need to work? What are the areas in which India and UK need to work for creating even better provisions? When it comes to free trade agreement, it is provisions related to intellectual property right, provisions related to movement of humans, visa liberalization, not only goods liberalization, provisions related to rules of origin dispute, provisions with respect to rules of origin disputes. All right. When it comes to policies of the countries affecting India, na, देखो, more or less what I will say is focus upon tariff diplomacy and how it basically impacts India's economic interest and India's economic sovereignty. Also how economic sovereignty has the potential of creating political sovereignty and how it is to be avoided. For example, US sanctioning Russia and then wanting India to follow that sanction. US sanctioning Russia and then wanting India to follow that sanction. Na? What it does is it impacts India's sovereignty, economic sovereignty, but also it impacts India's political sovereignty. What has to be done? Political sovereignty has not to be compromised. Political sovereignty has not to be compromised. Alright, national interest of India when it comes to foreign relations or international relations is of paramount importance. Moving on, look into when it comes to free trade agreements. This year, if the question is on free trade agreement, obviously it will be on India and UK. So if the question is on free trade agreement, if the question basically is on free trade agreement, what I want you to do is, I want you to first and foremost look into its positive aspects and look into what basically influenced, we have discussed it to a certain extent, what basically has influenced India and UK getting into or accelerating their free trade agreement, because India and UK have been speaking about free trade agreement for the last 20 years, 20-25 years. But achanak say in the last 3 months, what we see is an accelerated push towards this agreement, completion of this agreement. है ना? So वो एक आपको देखना पड़ेगा, and in the end, where we can, where we can push for areas of development or areas of improvement. That also we have discussed. Also, when it comes to free trade agreement, my advice is also look into the impact that will have on China, UK's relations with China, or China's footprint in UK. One more thing, India's free trade agreement with UK, what it also does is, it creates an impetus for India and EU getting into such an agreement. India and EU orienting towards such an agreement. ठीक है, तो ये सब चीजें do it once or look into it once. All right. So I will, एक minute. If there are any doubts, please let me know. If there are any doubts, please let me know. If there are any doubts, please let me know. Okay then. This was Mains Probable from the point of view of international relations. Thank you guys for joining in. Thank you for appreciating the efforts, and I hope you have gained something out of it. If you need any assistance from GS Core for your mains preparation, whether it be it this year or next year, please feel free to connect with us. One more thing, we have a Telegram channel, and on that Telegram channel, we do conduct daily answer writing sessions, which is of course free of cost. We like to guide students irrespective of our economic interest. That is our, you can say, our social responsibility. So we do it on our Telegram channel. The link of the Telegram channel is in the description section. You can be part of it. We will welcome you to be part of it. All right. Other than that, also, if you need to connect with me or any other faculty or faculties of GS Core, you can do so. How you can connect? Again, that info is available in the description section. Okay, so please feel free, come to us, let us resolve your issues, and let us see to it that you clear this examination. Thank you so much. Bye.